Brigada de los Estudios Culturales, and I think we said we would do the presentation kind of in Spanglish. I'll give the information in English, and we can certainly do the Q&A in Spanish afterward. So I'm really excited to be able to do this presentation. It's an honor and a pleasure. I was really, really thrilled with Professor Salvador. Like he said, I'm working on my PhD in Hispanic Cultural Studies at Michigan State University, so we've been colleagues for quite some time. I specialize broadly in 20th and 21st century Latin American literature and culture, but with an emphasis on Central America, and even more specifically Guatemala, although I'm also really interested in El Salvador. And in those two countries, I explore post-conflict violence after the civil wars, urban space, and culture more than anything. So my approach is definitely that of cultural studies, and I wanted to actually describe what that meant from part of my title, right, with the cultural studies. I was thinking about it in terms of the name of your course, Las Voces Silenciadas, or the Unheard Voices, which is really interesting to me because cultural studies, more than anything, tries to give, if not give voice to the voiceless, but definitely adequately represent the marginalized voices, everyday life, the ways in which people conduct and construct everyday life, and how related culture is the agent that mediates between people and their environment. I think that's the way that I approach cultural studies. So I just wanted to explain that part of the title. If we just give a little bit of a background, this is a map of Central America. We can see that it's made up of 7 countries: Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. It's interesting if we look at the geography of the region for a little bit, because we can see that El Salvador actually is the only country in Central America without a Caribbean coast, although it faces the Pacific, and it also borders Guatemala and Honduras. You'll note that at the top of the screen, I wrote América Central, una región silenciada. Again, thinking about the title of the course, Voces Silenciadas, I just thought it was really important to call attention to how Central America as a whole has been quite silenced. It's kind of hard to believe, especially when we consider the fact that Central America has been in the news in the past couple of years, and even this year in particular, right? When we think about the scores of children that are coming northward from the so-called Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, together is referred to as the Northern Triangle. Scores of children, unaccompanied minors, and especially young mothers making the harrowing trip to Mexico, to the southern United States, but also with the situation with temporary protected status ending for Salvadorans. At least 200,000 people of Salvadoran origin by the end of 2019. So yes, Central America has been in the news, it's been in the forefront of a lot of heated political debate in recent years. However, I still see it as una región silenciada, in the sense that when I look at my own field, Latin American cultural studies, we can see that countries like Argentina or Mexico or even Colombia, to a lesser extent Peru, are really, really dominating the conversation, which is great. Because these are countries that exercise power over less powerful Latin American countries, both in economic terms, in terms of their representation in the fields of cultural studies, and also in the popularity of the cultural production from these countries. In other words, it's a lot more likely we read a novel or see a movie from Mexico or Argentina than Guatemala, El Salvador, or Panama, for example, right? So it's just really interesting in that sense, because even within departments, Spanish departments, or Spanish and Portuguese, Romance studies, we have a lot of different names, right, depending on the university. Even within those academic spaces where you would think would be the most ideal venue to learn about Central America, is still very much silenced. Or just not represented at all. So people could read that in many different ways. I see it as a systematic, deeply politicized erasure of Central America. And I say it's deeply politicized, especially when we think of, again, the amount of people of Central American origin in the United States, and also the influence that the United States has had and continues to have in the region. In that sense, when we compare Central America, especially to Mexico, which is like the big brother to the north, we can see that Central America is a periphery of a periphery. Latin America as a whole marginalized in comparison to the US, but countries like Guatemala, El Salvador are double marginalized, not only by the US, but also by Mexico exercising some degree of power. There are academics that talk about this in the sense of sombras, hablando con sombras, shadows speaking with shadows, or different approaches there. So I just wanted to briefly mention that. If we continue with the map of El Salvador here, just zooming in a little bit to get a little bit better of an idea about the geography, again, bordering Guatemala, Honduras, and also the Pacific Ocean. The capital of San Salvador is in the middle of the country. And it's interesting to note that El Salvador, the meaning is the savior. It's a direct reference to God right in the name. And you can see in the image there, the Salvador del Mundo monument, which is in San Salvador, is a really important site and symbolism of El Salvador throughout the world. So that's just getting an idea of El Salvador. It's a really tiny country. It's got a population of about 7 million people in an area about the size of the US state of Massachusetts. So we're talking the smallest country in terms of area in Central America. However, it is the most densely populated. And that's something that's interesting. Actually, I want to before I jump forward to talk about a condensed description of the Salvadoran Civil War, I want to jump back for just a second to the map of Central America, because while the Civil War in El Salvador was going on, there was also the Civil War in Guatemala. We can compare it to our own Civil War in the US, right? Where it was lasting between 1861 and 1865, 4 years. Well, the timeline for Guatemala is much bigger. We're looking at 1960 to 1996, so that's almost 40 years of internal armed conflicts. And in the case of El Salvador, we're talking 1980 until 1992, so that's 12 years of internal armed conflicts. And then in Nicaragua, there was the Somoza dictatorship around the same time, 70s. So that was, I don't remember the exact years for that, but I know that was one of the longest dictatorships in the history of the entire world, actually. So we're looking at almost a domino effect of these countries that are very close together experiencing different types of conflicts at the same time. Honduras is interesting because their violence didn't come until later, in fact, very recently when things really surged after the 2009 coup d'etat. Spearheaded, unfortunately, by the Obama administration. That didn't come until later, but during the armed conflicts in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, Honduras served almost as a de facto military base due to the really heavy U.S. presence in the region at that time, which I'm going to hopefully be able to elaborate on a little bit more. So I'm going to just jump forward again, map of El Salvador, and then we look at a timeline, the fundamental events of the Salvadoran Civil War. You can all hear me okay still, right?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So if we look at the fundamental events of the Salvadoran Civil War, again, a period between 1980 and 1992, it's an infinitely complex period of time. It's actually quite difficult to make succinct, and to summarize in only a few words, although I'm going to do my best. It's important to understand that actually the main crux of the issue in El Salvador is not unlike what was going on in Guatemala, in the sense that the campesinos, or the peasant farmers in the 70s in El Salvador, really were interested in having more rights, especially in relation to the maintenance of land and natural resources. And they began striking for their rights, striking for control of the land and natural resources. And because of the striking, the armed forces started to respond with violence. And so, or at the very least with their presence in rural parts of El Salvador. And it was right from the beginning in 1980 that there was really a lot of tension between the campesinos, or the peasant farmers, and the elite classes of El Salvador that wanted to maintain control of the country. at this time, which is like 1980, right at the beginning of the conflicts, we see the development of the FMLN in the Spanish acronym, which is the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional. I can say that again just in case if you wanted to make note of that. The Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, which I just referred to throughout the rest of the presentation as FMLN. It was a coalition of different leftist groups that were opposed to the government. They announced their general, what's the word that I'm looking for? Well, I already kind of said it, the coalition. It was a convergence of different groups. The Fuerzas Populares, the Campesinos, the Resistencia Nacional, the Partido Comunista Salvadoreño, and the Partido Revolucionario de los Trabajadores Centroamericanos, pardon me. And that last one, the Partido Revolucionario de los Trabajadores Centroamericanos, that was a name that was adopted by other countries in the region, mainly Guatemala. So it was a convergence of different leftist groups that supported, it was very socialist, very Marxist, and really had a very firm, their beliefs were deep rooted in communism, in the traditional sense of what communism is. And I had, the idea that they had, rather, of communism was that property should be publicly owned and that people should be paid according to their needs and abilities. So that was, for them, what communism meant. Of course, it's a very scary word. We learn in school that that's something evil to be feared. When we think about the USSR having influence in Latin America. And in fact, that's actually what got people academically interested in Latin America in the first place. It was a way to contain communism, or just rather to contain Russia and the spread of communism, because this was not only happening in El Salvador, but also in Guatemala. The campesinos in favor of communism, the rightist elite groups not in favor of communism because they were very, very friendly with the United States at that time. So the FMLN really was a driving force of the conflicts, in that it provided an impetus, or what's the word I'm looking for? Just a platform for leftist guerrilla movements and for the voices, thinking about voces silenciadas, representation of the peasant farmers. Violence began to escalate very quickly. Like I said, the government was responding to the increased huelgas, or the strikes in the Salvadoran countryside. And one of the foremost critics of the violence in the region was a very famous Archbishop, Oscar Romero. He's probably, I would say, the most important figure of the Salvadoran Civil War itself, and I would say one of the most important Salvadoran figures ever in the world, as a face to represent El Salvador. We can compare with Rigoberta Menchú, who you're going to read pretty soon in the Guatemalan case as being, the face of Guatemalanness. I believe that Oscar Romero had the same effect in El Salvador. Oscar Romero was the Archbishop of San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, and he very much was praying, but also trying to just really get people to see their country in a positive light, and he really, really wanted to just see an end to the conflicts between the FMLN and their allies and the government forces. And he was critical of that. He just didn't want there to be any violence, simply, in the country. And because he was very outspoken, and because he gave church services, well, it was actually in a chapel in San Salvador on the weekends, to offer a space, because the city, the capital city at that time, still wasn't really involved too much in the armed conflicts. It was a sanctuary of sorts, and then the chapel with the Archbishop was a sanctuary within the sanctuary. It was supposed to be a safe place where people could go. However, on the 24th of March, 1980, so it's still right at the very beginning of the Salvadoran Civil War, Oscar Romero was giving a service as usual, speaking out against the violence, and a supporter of the government pulled up in a car alongside the chapel and shot directly down the pews and ended up shooting Romero right in the heart, and he died in that moment. And so all of a sudden, the chapel, which was meant to be a sanctuary, a safe space away from the violence, it became another front in the Salvadoran Civil War. Not only did the Civil War come to the city, in a sense, in that moment, but also, you know, there was the notion that no place was safe. In 1982, afterward, and we'll talk a little bit more about Romero in a second, but just to give an overview of some of the main events, in 1982, Arena, which was a far right-wing group, won the elections, the presidential elections in El Salvador. And so that was really like the clase élite, in my mind anyway, really showing that, you know, we don't really care about the campesinos. You know, we're still interested in holding on to our control and holding on to our relationship with the United States, right? I mean, as the FMLN began clashing with Arena and other groups, I mean, we even saw not only, you know, we saw the chapel and Romero's case becoming a war zone, but even the Sheridan in San Salvador became a site where there was a bombing. Death squads began operating in San Salvador. You saw things like child soldier recruitment, people being disappeared, which is a very common theme throughout Latin America, not just Central America, but certainly in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and other places. People actually like us, university professors and students who were, you know, outwardly against the violence and speaking about that in their academic work. They were disappearing. The United States, through the presidencies of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, was very deeply allied with the Salvadoran elitists and provided a lot of military aid to the government and also arms, because again, it was in their mind to stop the spread of communism in a way to contain Russia. Not only was that a point of interest for academics, but also for the US government in that time. So that was why, I mean, we also supported, you know, whether we like to, you know, acknowledge this or not, we also supported the governments of Guatemala, which, you know, were responsible for killing over 200,000 people. So I think the numbers in El Salvador are like 70,000, you know, a lot less, but still an incredible amount of human loss in these years. In 1989, there were a series of really, really bad attacks actually perpetrated by the FMLN. So, you know, we can give them the good guy persona, but at the same time, they were also culpable for a lot of the violence in the country. Finally, in 1992, the FMLN was recognized as a political party in El Salvador, and the Acuerdos de Paz, or the Acuerdos de Chapultepec, which is actually in Mexico, but the peace accords officially ending the internal armed conflicts in El Salvador took place in 1992, which we can see in that newspaper article. Again, I'm giving very succinct, very brief summary of the events of the Salvadoran Civil War. Like the internal armed conflicts in Guatemala and Nicaragua, it's just an infinitely complex, event with a lot of different elements. But for me, those are some of the most important aspects of the conflicts. If we want to continue a little bit and talk just briefly about Oscar Romero again, you know, he was the Archbishop of San Salvador, spoke out against the violence in the countryside, the most important figure, I would say, to come out of the conflicts. These are my own photographs from when I went to visit the chapel in San Salvador, where you can see, I mean, he was standing directly at the end there, that's where he was shot. And there's the rectory or the quarters nearby where he stayed, where you can go in and see the portrait of him and also his robes hanging up behind the glass. And if you look carefully on the picture on the far right up there, you can see the white robes with the stain. That's actually the blood stain still on there since 1980 from when he was shot. And so all of a sudden, by going to the space, it really makes the Civil War very, very human. It makes it a space where, oh my gosh, this really did actually happen right here, and I can come here, you know, as somebody who wants to, on the one hand, understand the culture and the history of the country, but I mean, this is really where it happened, right here. It's a very chilling, very moving place to go in person, and a lot of people, actually that picture is rather, it's not really very representative in the middle because I just happened to get it when a service had been ending, but people are constantly going there to pay their respects to Oscar Romero. I mean, he's just a hero in El Salvador, somebody who represents something as simple as standing up for the right thing. I mean, even the International Airport in San Salvador was renamed after Oscar Romero, so he's a really, really important figure. If we think about what post-war El Salvador means, though, it's not so simple. In the sense that, okay, the peace accords were signed in 1992, it should be over, right? 1992 was a long time ago, right? Like 25, 26 years ago, it's over. But not necessarily. That violence, that, especially that urban violence, that extreme masculinity, associated originally with the military and the child recruitment, right? I mean, that's still very much part of Salvadoran culture. We see on the one hand that there's a lot of modernization, a big skyscraper on the Boulevard de los Héroes in San Salvador, and you can see the Golden Arches, McDonald's and Wendy's and all this, a Nissan dealership and wonderful places to go that are pretty and glitzy. Yes, there's that modern development that has been able to take place after the end of the conflicts, but it's still, the violence is still so present, and resistance to violence is still very much present everywhere you look. And the second photograph, you can see, Recuerda el pasado visitando tu mercado ex cuartel. I mean, the actual army barracks that were in the center of San Salvador are now being used as the Mercado Central, the central market in the city. So the same spaces that were once a front in the Civil War are actually a very everyday space for people to go to buy goods and also souvenirs there. Actually, I bought a t-shirt there that was really quite humorous. It said something along the lines of, I survived, and it was actually a t-shirt in Spanglish, which I also appreciated because it said, I survived in El Salvador sin ninguna bala encima, without one bullet on top of me. So, I mean, that's just, people kind of, can almost make humor out of it, but really it's the ex-cuartel market, the ex-army barracks are now the market. And then the next picture is at the very, very lefty Universidad de El Salvador, which is in the capital, and it says, no leas para saber más, sino para ignorar menos. Don't read to know more, but rather to ignore less, which is a very, Professor Montalvo just discussing about how decolonial that is, right, in terms of taking ownership of your learning, not taking things at face value. These are really interesting points that resonate with a lot of young people in El Salvador today that actually, in many ways, might not be so different from us. So yes, the war is very much present. But how are people responding to the war, I think, is the most important question, and especially in terms of your course. Again, the voces silenciadas, which unheard voices are exposed in the cultural production. What does a cultural production do? Well, the cultural production on the one hand, and by cultural production I mean novels mostly, but it could also be magazines or film, it can really show, again, thinking about cultural studies, how people are conducting and constructing everyday life, how people are coming out from underneath those internal armed conflicts to espouse normalcy somehow, which takes an incredible amount of courage. How do people, maybe they lost family members who were disappeared, maybe their family members are in the diaspora, whether they're in Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. or Melbourne, Australia. How are they continuing life? How are mothers continuing after they've lost their children either to the violence or, might not even know their whereabouts exactly because they've begun the journey northward? How are normal people really trying to espouse normalcy after the war? Teachers, professors, people in the marketplace, okay? And so one of the most important authors of the post-war era in El Salvador is Horacio Castellanos Moya. And he's actually very, very, está de moda now. He's very, very hot in the sense that people are really reading his work. It's being translated into English with fervor, which is great. He actually, Castellanos Moya is really interesting because he got his start in a magazine called Tendencias in San Salvador, which was a magazine for mostly really, really lefty, university-esque type people into literature and poetry, just looking for creative ways to write about either what happened or more likely what's going on now in the post-war era. So he got to start there, and then he published a novel, El Asco, which you can see the cover there, about a art history professor at McGill University in Montreal who goes back. He had left San Salvador during the violence. He goes back because his mother passed away, and it's his critique of absolutely everything in the country, and that's a really interesting one. And El Arma en el Hombre is also another really important work by Castellanos Moya about ex-Salvadoran guerrillero, rather, who after the war has no other oficio or job other than using a gun. And so once the war was over in El Salvador, he goes to Guatemala and continues to fight because the war was still going on there. A really cool point about Castellanos Moya is actually that he's your neighbor. He's actually at the University of Iowa right now. So that's really, really cool to think about him being so close by. He's part of the creative writing program there, which was one of the top ones in the country. He works there as a professor. So that's just something really, really cool about Castellanos Moya being so close by Chihuahua. Another important author is Claudia Ananda, so you can see there, who has a really interesting take on things in her collection of short stories, De Fronteras, because she talks about human and animal relations in the sense that animals could potentially be, this is after the violence in El Salvador, they could be more attuned to feelings, could be more attuned to emotions, and that possibility is really interesting. Mario Bencastro, who you'll read, is another important one with Árbol de la Vida, Disparo en la Catedral. I'll expand a little bit more about him in just a second. But then also beyond the cultural production itself, there are really important spaces, especially in San Salvador, in the capital, like the Anthropology Museum, where there's a lot of art installations, very lefty, throughout the city that are very, very much linked with memory or the preservation of memory or la recuperación de la memoria histórica, these types of initiatives which are really, really quite powerful in El Salvador now. And so we focus on Mario Bencastro. I tried to choose a really fun, he looks like a really fun, happy person in that picture, so I really like that one. He was born in Huachapan, which is in the western part of El Salvador in 1949, and actually, aside from a novelist, and he's written theater production, but he's also a painter, actually. He's the winner of many national and international prizes. And he divides his time between Miami and San Salvador, although I think now he spends most of his time in Miami. He actually studied formally to become a painter, and he really wanted to use his art to reflect the social problems of the country. But then this desire it also went to his literary work. And his first novel, Disparo en la Catedral, was in 1990, and it's a literary reconstruction of the assassination of Archbishop Romero. So that's a really interesting one. And of course, Árbol de la Vida, or The Tree of Life, which has a translation in English that came in, I believe, in 1997, if I'm not mistaken, which is a collection of short stories about urban violence and other themes that are related to urban violence like that. Again, that extreme masculinity. It's important to note that Árbol de la Vida, although it was written just after the war, the stories in that book take place during the war in San Salvador. So that's important to remember. Urban violence, that extreme masculinity, everyday violence as seen through bodies in the streets, or violence against women, or even just the courageous act of trying to survive under such difficult conditions. That's really the premise of his short stories, Árbol de la Vida. So that's Mario Bencastro, who you look at pretty soon in the course. And these images here are paintings that are at the Anthropology Museum in San Salvador, and the left one looks like it's a chronological representation of Salvadoran history, with the conquistadores coming from Spain, and then imparting their language, their ways of life, and the indigenous people, and then of course the Civil War, and you can see the man with his arms stretched out. It's Archbishop Romero. And the angel is ready to receive him in heaven. So it's a really, really powerful, and actually right below you can see the representation of when he was shot. So that's a really powerful one. And then on the right-hand side is just another representation of Salvadoran history with Romero in the bottom, it looks like in white. So that's another way that we can see. I mean, this is a very formal piece of art at the Anthropology Museum, but you can also see art installations, like I said, throughout the city of San Salvador, where people are really trying to make sense of what the internal armed conflicts meant and what the continued violence means now for Salvadoran society. And that brings me to current problems. I kind of, have been hinting at it a little bit. I remember when I was in, I was in Guatemala for a couple of weeks in 2015, conducting research, and I was able to go to El Salvador for a couple of days, and I was in the capital city, and as soon as I got to the hotel, I saw the newspaper, which you see in the upper left portion of the screen, El Diario de Hoy, where it says, 5 personas desaparecen cada día en El Salvador. And I was talking about this with Professor Montalvo the other night, because, if we compare, what did you say, Jonathan, that like 4 million people live in Iowa, maybe?
3 to 4 million, I think.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, okay, so El Salvador has quite a few more, like 7 million. But imagine, 5 people a day disappear in El Salvador. What would it be like if 5 people a day disappeared in Iowa or in Michigan, where I live? How would people respond to that? I mean, yes, it's a headline, big letters, right? But it's still very much just an everyday aspect of life. If we consult sources like Insight Crime, which if you're interested in crime in Latin America and the Caribbean and how people respond to it, Insight Crime can be a really interesting source. They gave the homicide statistics for 2017 recently, and El Salvador, in addition to Venezuela, is one of the highest in the region, unfortunately. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the war gave birth to a climate of absolute impunity where people can get away with anything. There are quote-unquote recycled weapons that are quote-unquote left over from war that people have, just that militarization of everyday life, men with guns. It's just being recycled. Instead of young boys being recruited to be part of the army, which is what happened during the Civil War, in many cases, fortunately, they're being recruited to be part of transnational criminal organizations, which could be linked to the drug cartels in Mexico or Colombia, but also the gangs such as Mara Salvatrucha, who you see there, or Barrio 18, who and of course, there are many other gangs, but those are just the most prominent ones. I mean, they're constantly fighting for control of different aspects of Salvadoran society. They engage in murder for hire and extortion, armed robbery, often very violent. I mean, unfortunately, this is something that really, really is a pervasive problem in El Salvador today. As far as the gangs like Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18 are concerned, it's important to realize that actually they got their start in Los Angeles. They were the family members of people who had fled the violence in El Salvador during the Civil War, got their start in Los Angeles, and once they were either deported or returned of their own volition to El Salvador, they had no family, but in most cases they were deported. And so this idea of being part of a gang, that was their family, right? But just a really, really dangerous group that unfortunately has become to an extent a symbol of culture in El Salvador. The last photograph there is of soldiers in the back of a pickup truck with their arms doing a everyday patrol of a neighborhood in San Salvador. That was my picture there. So when I saw that, I knew that I was in San Salvador and had to be careful. I mean, these are just some of the social problems, but there's an uncertain future in the country. I kind of hinted at it through the cultural production, just in the ways in which people are responding. We have the literature, the art, despite all the problems that are going on. We also have places like El Parque Cuscuatlan, which you see here, which is a big wall that goes around the whole park where you have names that are etched in of people who lost their lives during internal conflicts. It kind of reminds me of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. in that sense, because you can see people going up to the facade and just kind of, taking a piece of paper with a pencil and etching their relatives' names. And then there's some engravings there, representations of rebirth after the war, and then the wall just kind of stops. And to me, that sends the message that, we, if not Salvadoran ourselves, but friends of El Salvador can help, to reconstruct a better future for the country. And on a positive note, just to kind of end, we can think of El Salvador's national dish, the pupusa, which is also very popular in other parts of Central America. If you're not sure, it's basically just an extra fat tortilla that's stuffed with either cheese or pork or beans or maybe even all of those things, which is probably your best fat. It's fantastic. Or vegetables that we don't know what they are exactly, but we eat it anyway because it's in a pupusa and there's no way it's not going to be good. So there's a campaign, Make Pupusas Not War, which is set forth by Salvadoran people living in the United States, just again to help in any way we can to make the country, or at least the image of the country, dignified despite all of the violence that continues to characterize Salvadoran life. And one way we can do that is by talking about the cultural production, the literature, by reading that, reflecting upon that, making comparisons. I was talking with Professor Montalvo last night about just the situation in El Salvador, and in the context, actually, I should have said this at the beginning. I was going to interject, but I wanted to keep going through the presentation. Actually, I think I forgot to mention my own background as being someone who was born in Guatemala in 1990 during their civil war. So by me studying this, especially through the lens of urban subjectivities in both Guatemala and El Salvador, it's a way for me, on the one hand, to understand myself. So that was something that I think I forgot to mention that I'm sharing with you now. But there was a student one time who actually, because I had watched in a course, Voces Inocentes, which I believe you're going to be watching soon, had asked me something like, do you think we'll ever see in our lifetimes the after effects of the Civil War in El Salvador go away, or in Guatemala for that matter? And I said, well, on the one hand, that's a very complex question, but if we compare it with our own Civil War in the U.S. that ended in 1865, do you think the remnants of that have completely gone away yet? And that's the answer to that question. So I hope that my presentation was able to shed light on El Salvador, again with the Voces Silenciadas, the unheard voices. There definitely are way too many unheard voices coming from El Salvador, so I hope that this presentation helped to shed light on the country. So thank you so much. I appreciate you listening.
All right. Thank you, Bentley. Now we have a round of questions. Las preguntas pueden ser en español y en inglés. Recuerden que esta sigue siendo la clase de español, así que cualquier pregunta que tengan relacionada a la presentación o a la lectura que tuvimos asignada para la clase. ¿Alguien? A ver, cada uno tiene que hacer una pregunta. Comenzamos con Tatiana. Adelante, Tatiana. ¿Tienes alguna pregunta, alguna inquietud, algo que te llama la atención?
How involved is the U.S. still with El Salvador, especially knowing that El Salvador is an underdeveloped country right now? Are they helping them better their economy, or they're just not helping them anymore?
Well, I mean, this can potentially be kind of, a sensitive subject in the sense, like I brought up a little bit about the temporary protected status for not only Salvadorans, but also Haitians and other people in Latin America and the Caribbean region ending by the end of 2019. In theory, our government is trying to support the idea that, oh my gosh, these people, actually I should say that the Salvadorans with PPX are those who arrived to the U.S. in 2001 after there was a big earthquake, actually 2 big earthquakes in El Salvador, but also remnants from the Civil War, of course. And the idea is that, okay, they've been here in some cases since 2001, a really long time. They've acquired a lot of skills in the U.S., and then they can go back and go to their country, make it a happy place, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. But it's just not that simple, especially for women, especially for LGBTQ people, especially for young people who will either become recruited or potential victims by gangs. So actually, I would say our relation with El Salvador now is quite rocky, quite volatile, just because it's a country that's so incredibly misunderstood in that sense. As far as then, during the armed conflicts, I mentioned how under the auspices of Reagan and Carter administrations. We provided funding through the militarization, through arms, to the Salvadoran Civil War. So that's something that I think warrants our attention. As of right now, out of all the Central American countries, Salvador has the most national living in the United States. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know that there are significantly larger numbers. So as far as if anybody is going to help us expose Central America and its problems in the U.S. now, certainly the Salvadoran community. I hope that somewhat answers the question.
Okay. ¿Otra pregunta? A ver, ¿quién quiere ser próximo? Todos van a tener que hacer alguna pregunta en español o en inglés, preferiblemente en español. ¿Ah? Anything related to the presentation.
So, the kids that you said they recruited into like, were they like kidnapped from their families, or were they like family members of the people who were already in the games?
Well, in the sense of the army back in the Civil War, a lot of times they were kidnapped from their families, but a lot of times, it was in the name of FMLN or Arena, whether it's the leftist or this group. In many cases they were offered by their families, which is really, really perverse, and the same thing happened in Guatemala. But as far as the Lucha and the gangs now, oftentimes they're recruited either in school or in the community. I mean, it really is a pervasive problem. Often, it's not that they're coerced into doing it. They do eventually go on their own volition with the promise of brotherhood and, an alternative, perhaps, family situations, with the promise that your status in the game will go up as you work for us, i.e. killing people. And I mean, it is rather unnerving, but you'll see 12-year-olds who know how to use a gun, or younger even, who have already killed. So it's really quite tragic in that sense. But we see parallels, just in the pure sense of not only being during the war, but now an idea that's way for war to be recycled to the games in El Salvador.
Son las guerras en Latin America más personas contra personas o personas contra el gobierno?
Otra vez, la pregunta no entiendo, lo siento.
Okay.
¿Puedes hablar un poco más alto?
Okay, son las guerras en Latin America más personas contra personas o personas contra el gobierno?
Creo que son las dos cosas, ¿cierto? Creo que son las dos cosas, porque es importante tener en cuenta el hecho de que hay personas que representan diferentes aspectos del gobierno. Los miembros del FMLN, este grupo de izquierda, Atlantis Group, ¿no es cierto? Ellos estaban en contra del gobierno y querían fomentar, o encourage, ¿no es cierto?, el comunismo en El Salvador, también los derechos de los campesinos. Pero las personas que representaban Arena eran las personas que estaban más bien vinculadas o conectadas con los esfuerzos de los Estados Unidos. Entonces, para mí son las dos cosas, persona por persona en el sentido comunitario, vecinos, ¿no es cierto?, pero también contra el gobierno, las dos cosas.
Sí, claro, la guerra, ¿no?, causó mucha división entre familias también, en algunas ocasiones. ¿Gerardo, tienes alguna?
¿Quién beneficia por silenciar El Salvador? O sea, ¿por qué está silenciado El Salvador y otros países en Centroamérica? ¿Quién gana? O sea, ¿quién beneficia por eso?
Es una pregunta buenísima porque especialmente si recordamos los acuerdos de Chapultepec, los acuerdos de paz que pusieron oficialmente a la guerra civil salvadoreña. Tenemos que preguntarnos a nosotros mismos, ¿quién tiene el control de los acuerdos? Es el Estado, es el gobierno. ¿no es cierto? Entonces, en este sentido, el gobierno o el Estado está, entre comillas, ganando, ¿no es cierto? Solo a través de la producción cultural podemos poner las perspectivas de las personas en las comunidades. Pero en cuanto a los acuerdos, a las comisiones de verdad, ¿no es cierto? El Estado tiene todo el control. En mis propias investigaciones estoy viendo un sitio interesante en Guatemala que se llama el Archivo Histórico de la Poesía Nacional. Los archivos podemos ver otra vez que el Estado tiene todo el control sobre el contenido de los documentos. Solo a través de la literatura podemos ver las perspectivas de las personas cotidianas como nosotros, pero el gobierno sigue ganando, especialmente si tomamos en cuenta la corrupción ahora mismo en varios países las acciones de presidentes centroamericanos en este momento. ¿Sí?
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿No? Muchísimas gracias otra vez, Andrew. Fue un
Gracias
placer.
a ustedes.
Y esperamos que los estudiantes disfruten la lectura del miércoles. Van a tener que leer a Mario Ben Castro, uno de los autores del Salvador, y el viernes tienen que ver la película Voces Inocentes, que Andrew Bentley le acaba de mencionar en su presentación, y esperemos que a través de esas dos cosas podamos entender un poco mejor el contexto, ¿no? Del que nos habló Andrew Bentley en su presentación. Así que es importante escuchar esas voces silenciadas. Es importante, ¿no? It matters to listen to those voices from Central America that have been very marginalized. Okay? So, gracias, Andrew, y nos